Today's scripture reading is taken from Exodus chapter 32, verses 1 to 6 and 30 to 35. When the people saw that Moses was so long in coming down from the mountain, they gathered around Aaron and said, "Come, make us gods who will go before us. As for this fellow Moses, who brought us up out of Egypt, we don't know what has happened to him." Aaron answered them, "Take off the gold earrings that your wives, your sons, and your daughters are wearing, and bring them to me." So all the people took off their earrings and brought them to Aaron. He took what they handed him and made it into an idol cast in the shape of a calf, fashioning it with a tool. Then they said, "These are your gods, Israel, who brought you up of Egypt." When Aaron saw this, he built an altar in front of the calf and announced, "Tomorrow there will be a festival to the Lord." So the next day the people rose early and sacrificed burnt offerings and presented fellowship offerings. Afterward they sat down to eat and drink and got up to indulge in revelry. The next day Moses said to the people, "You have committed a great sin, but now I will go up to the Lord. Perhaps I can make atonement for your sin." So Moses went back to the Lord and said, "Oh, what a great sin these people have committed. They have made themselves gods of gold. But now, please forgive their sin. But if not, then blot me out of the book you have written." The Lord replied to Moses, "Whoever has sinned against me, I will blot out of my book. Now go, lead the people to the place I spoke of, and my angel will go before you. However, when the time comes for me to punish, I will punish them for their sin." And the Lord struck the people with a plague because of what they did with the calf Aaron had made. This is the word of the Lord.
I don't know what you are expecting 2020 to be like. Some have prospered in 2019 and some expect 2020 to go well. Some are expecting tough times and tougher times in 2020. Singapore barely escaped the recession at 0.7% growth, right? So some say, well, next year might be 0.8%. So a lot of people have this attitude of hang in there. But it doesn't really matter because you know how it is sometimes. A country can be prospering and you can be languishing. When Singapore was prospering and manufacturing was leaving Singapore, if you are in manufacturing, you are languishing. If you are in your 40s, 50s, and you are a supervisor in a factory, guess what? The jobs are not coming back. It doesn't matter how good, how skillful you are, the jobs are not coming back. The country can be prospering, but you may not be prospering. Conversely, the country may be suffering a recession and you happen to be in an industry, in a field that prospers you, and that is really what matters at the end of it. Now, I think regardless of how 2020 might turn out, assuming it is going to be a difficult year, I think the important thing is to ask how we can thrive in that situation. What we have in Israel is the Israelites going through the wilderness. They were going through a wilderness journey. It was going to be a dry, tough time. And they did certain things that they should not be doing because they exacerbated the troubles that they were facing. So this is what we're going to be talking about today. So I recently received a picture and I thought it was kind of cute, so I thought I'll share it with you. It says, in 2020, may we have the strength of this stool. I don't know whether you can see what the stool is supporting. And the face of this dog. Can you see the little dog there under the stool? Yeah. Well, maybe that's what we need for 2020. Yeah? The strength of the stool and the faith of the dog. But seriously, what we have is to ask ourselves how a passage like this applies to us at this time. Now, if we were to cultivate our relationship with God, we can actually thrive in risky situations. When I cross the roads in Manila, and some of you have been to Manila, it is a high-risk situation. Cars are zooming all over, and you cross halfway, and you duck this car, and hope that this next car doesn't run you down. You're in a high-risk situation. Not only that, just walking the pavement, the pavements are uneven, there are holes inside there, and you are looking where you are going because it's dangerous, because it's risky. But in my trips around Manila, I've never fallen into a hole. I've never been close to being run over by a car. Now, conversely, when I first got to the United States, I was visiting this town called Cape May in New Jersey. It is a resort town. It's very quiet. There are no cars on the road and everything is honky-dory. And that was the time when I almost died because I stepped onto the road and the car zoomed right in front of me. And that was because they drive on the different side of the road and I was looking at the wrong side when I crossed. Okay. Sometimes things can be so peaceful. And because it's no risk, we are actually under great risk. And sometimes because there is risk, we can thrive through that risk. And how can we do so? Well, I'd like to suggest to you this. That there are 4 things about God that we should not ask. When the situation gets tough, when we're in the wilderness journey, there are 4 things we should not ask. And what are these 4 things? I'd like to wind back a little bit to when we were at Exodus 19. We were talking about the Israelites coming to the foot of Mount Sinai, right? They had been there. This was the first day of the 3rd month, and there was this great cloud covering the mountain, and the mountain was shaking. There was this earthquake and pealing and thunder, and then there was the sound of a trumpet of all things. And the trumpet sound got louder and louder, and the people couldn't stand it, and they closed their ears, And all that, through that picture, we saw 3 things about God. First, He's a beckoning God. He wants to communicate with the people. Next, He's a terrifying God, because when God shows His power, it's a scary thing. He's an untamable God. But third, we see also that He's a mediating God. So between the God who wants to communicate with us and the God who in His power is terrifying, He creates a mediator in Moses. And Moses was the one that communicated between God and the people. And in our day, it is Jesus Christ, that mediator, that mediates between the holy, awesome, terrifying God and the beckoning God. Then we come to Exodus 24. In Exodus 24, Moses went up the mountain again, and this time for about 40 days. The first 6 days, we are told that there was this cloud that came on the mountain, and it was kind of scary and all that. And then after that, the cloud lifted, and it stayed on for a while. And this is what brings us to Exodus 32, the passage that we are considering today. You see, when the people saw that Moses was so long in coming down from the mountain, they gathered around Aaron and said, "Come, make us gods who will go before us. For this fellow Moses, who brought us up out of Egypt, we don't know what has happened to him." Now, the people probably thought that Moses had died because he was up there for 6 days. There were all these things going on top of the mountain. And then he didn't come down for 40 days. 40 days, it's a long time. There's no food up there. There's no water up there. He couldn't have survived. So they say, well, as for this fellow, we don't know what has happened to him. The Jews are a little bit like the Chinese. They speak in euphemisms. They don't say he has died. Okay, a polite way of saying, if something happens to you, what will happen to your estate? If something happens to you, what's that something? We kind of avoid saying some of these things. Okay, so something has happened to him. Okay, and we don't know what has happened. Okay, so they thought that he was probably dead, and they went to Aaron, the high priest. Now we are told that they gathered around him. They gathered around Aaron. This was not so much as like you going to see your member of parliament. You've got a grievance, you go up to him and say, "What do I do now?" This gathering has a sense of aggressiveness, meaning that there was a mob of people crowding around him saying that we need a solution to this. Okay, and so they gathered around him and say, "Come, make us gods who will go before us." So the first point I'd like to make is this. They didn't want to wait for Moses to come down. The God of the Bible at that point in time was a God that they didn't quite like very much, because God says, when I move, you move, when I stay, you stay. And nothing was happening, and they couldn't wait. So what they were looking for really was this, that they were looking for a God that they could manage. And this is a warning to us that we should not ask for a God that we can manage. Okay. Now, to be honest with you, I would say that I also want a God that I can manage. I mean, a God who is beyond, who is untamable, as we are told, who is untamable. It's very difficult for us to kind of wrap our minds around it. And so we want a God that we can somehow manage. I want a God who answers me when I need an answer. Okay. I know some of you may have felt this way before. God just tell me yes or no. Yes is okay, no is okay. Then you pray and then God doesn't answer. There's no yes, there's no no. And you don't know what else to do next. I don't know, some of you have been in that situation before, right? And you say, waiting is really difficult. And God was just telling them, wait. Just wait, and that was all. But waiting was extremely difficult. They wanted an answer. Yes or no, good or bad, please tell me, so I can move on ahead. They wanted a God that would go before us. They wanted a God that would lead them. They were kind of directionless. And they want a God who would give an answer when they want an answer. That was basically what it was. And I think I'm guilty of that too. I don't know if you're guilty of that. There are times when I'm kind of miserable because, God, I really need an answer from you. Why aren't you answering me? And sometimes God will answer right away. Sometimes God takes his time. This is important because we try to straitjacket God and sort of make him one thing or another. We want a God who answers us when we want an answer, and we find this attempt to define God in a certain way, to make God function in a certain way, is seen in the life of Jesus. When Jesus started ministering, you're wondering, what is this guy? Is he a Pharisee? And then they say, yeah, some of the things that he said seems to suggest that he's of this particular religious group called the Pharisees. Then they say, no, he cannot be, because he said this other stuff. Is he a Sadducee? No, he's definitely not a Sadducee. Nor is he a Zealot, nor is he a Herodian, and they couldn't put a category onto Jesus. Well, Jesus basically says, I am who I am, like what Yahweh said. I am who I am. I'm self-defining. You do not define me according to your existing categories. Okay. Now, sometimes we are just impatient with our lives and we want to get on with the wilderness journey. Some of us may think that you are in a difficult time in a wilderness journey and you want it to end yesterday. And if God is not leading, then I'm going to find a God who will lead. I'm going to find a God who does lead. Well, it is not that God is not leading, because his leading at that point in time is just to wait. And we seem to think that waiting is a terrible thing. But I think one thing for me to trust in God is that, number one, waiting is not a bad thing, and that his leading includes waiting. There was once when I was driving and it was green light and I was just driving normally through a junction, and then suddenly this car shot across in front of me. That means he was cutting through a red light and he didn't slow down or anything like that, and I don't think he was doing it deliberately. I think he just didn't notice that it was a red light. Sometimes that happens to people. If I had been 2 seconds earlier, I would have been broadsided and probably dead. Okay. Now, I cannot recall what happened earlier on. Maybe there was a stoplight that I stopped longer. Maybe somebody cut in front of me to delay me by a few seconds, Whatever it was the delay of 2 seconds that saved me. And I don't even know how the Lord did that in that delaying process. So sometimes waiting is not such a bad thing, because God has a timing in our life, and sometimes he doesn't tell us why we are waiting. I know some of you who are drivers, and myself included, when people cut in front of you, get really annoyed. But come to think of it, that is probably only 1 second difference. So maybe no need to get so annoyed if somebody cuts in front of you. Well, what I'm saying here is this, that is that we do not ask for a God that we can manage. When God's instruction or silence at that point meant to wait for him, then we just wait for him. The next thing is that I should not ask for a God I can see. The people told Aaron, come, make us gods who will go before us. The fact that it can be made means that it is visible. They wanted a visible, seeing God. Well, eventually Aaron made an idol for them, and that tells us also the nature of their request. Now, the first of the 10 commandments says, you will have no other gods before me. There is no other God beside me. And then the second command says, you shall not make for yourself an image in the form of anything in heaven or on earth. So this was the command that they were transgressing at this particular point in time. Now, today we say that we don't really worship idols anymore. Well, some people still do, but that's not so much a global concern anymore. But the first point that I'd like to make is this. You see, the physical image that is made is usually the result of the mental image. That means when a person carves an image and turns it and declares it to be a god or a deity of some sort, that is usually the result of what they are thinking in their minds. And they are trying to concretize that image and turn it into something. And that is basically what it is done. Now, why it is so wrong is that it limits God and it begins to lock God into a certain image. It is just like some even Christians who must always look at the cross when they are praying, or crucifix, or they must be doing something when they are praying. That locks our image to a certain dimension of God, and God doesn't want that. He says, don't lock me in. Don't lock me in with an image. I'm not to be represented by an image. You can say that it is only a symbol of something else, but God clearly says no. The second point I'd like to say why it is a problem is that, you see, Yahweh, the Lord, does not judge other people for making idols. In other words, when you look at the Old Testament, you don't find God saying, the Egyptians worship idols, I'm going to discipline them. Or the Assyrians worship idols, I'm going to discipline them. None of them were ever confronted with making idols. It was only for Israel that they were confronted with making idols, because God had a relationship with them. And He says, in that relationship, these are some of the things that we are to observe. And so, it is important for us as Christians, when we are approaching people, to understand that, they are not obligated to live by our rules. Okay? They are not obligated to, worship only God, because these people are not yet in a relationship with God. More importantly, is that we ask ourselves whether we are in that right relationship with God or not. The third point is that, are we also asking for a God we can see? You see, while we may not have a carved image, among some Christian circles, there's a lot of emphasis on dreams and on visions. While it may not be a physical image, it is still an image that they want to see. Now, if God should so privilege you with a dream or a vision of Himself, well, that's wonderful. But these things are rare. They do not happen often. And the person who is consistently seeing these dreams and visions, well, I'm not sure whether they're from God or not, but the person who is longing, desiring, demanding, and whose faith is sustained by dreams and visions, is just another manifestation of a person asking for a God he can see. So I should not be asking for a God I can see. The third point that I'd like to share with you is that I should not ask for a God I can define or redefine. You see this in verse 4. Aaron took what they had given him, cast it into an idol, and then he said, these are your gods, Israel, who have brought you up out of Egypt. So he didn't say that this is a different God, this golden calf that he made out of it, but he says, these are your gods. And then tomorrow, there will be a festival to the Lord. When it's in capital L-O-R-D, it means the name Yahweh. This is Yahweh, this is your God. Okay, so what Aaron did was this. He was saying, yes, Yahweh is the one that delivered you from Egypt, and this image, the golden calf, is that God that delivered you from Egypt. And so you are going to make sacrifices to Yahweh by making sacrifices to this golden calf. So in a certain sense, they were still worshipping Yahweh. They have not transgressed the first commandment. The first commandment is you will not have any God besides me. So they are not worshipping another God. It's the same God, right? And then the second command is you will not make graven image. Now that is the one that is that they have transgressed. You see, what happens What happens when we make graven images and create all these images? Well, we can very easily redefine God. If I were a legalist, that means I like rules and regulations. I believe there should be rules and regulations for everything. My image of God will almost invariably be that this is a God that gives us all the rules. So I want to know what rules I have from Him. Okay, that is because I'm a legalist. On the other hand, if I just love the concept of love, everything is I love you, then you have a God of love. Then you have got a mushy God who is a bit like a teddy bear. So that would be we tend to project ourselves onto God. Now, if a person loves violence, then you'll look at the Old Testament and say, oh, God is a killer. He's killed so many people and all these things that are happening, and we tend to project that to God. Now, if I were academic, I can simply study the Bible and that's it, and that's my God, the God of minutiae and details, passing of verbs and understanding of conjugations, and then that goes no end. Okay. One day I was in a car with this lady, and I was driving, and she was talking about God. She's a Christian, at least from what she says. And she started talking about God in the female, I don't know how to, let's say, for example, I don't know what it means sometimes when I pray to her, and so I thought the first time that I heard wrongly. Okay? As the conversation went on, I heard 2 or 3 more times this lady referring to God as feminine. Now, I immediately knew where she stood, right? She's a feminist. And we tend to project something of ourselves into God. And so this is the problem that the people have. They wanted to project something of themselves into a God that they could understand. The archaeologists in about 1990, they successfully uncovered a golden calf. Not the one that they made at this point, but a replica. See, the worship of the golden calf came earlier, even before this time. The golden calf that was discovered was 16th century BC, and it was about 4.5 inches high and 4.5 inches wide or long. And so that was actually something that was quite significant, because some people say, well, we've never seen any golden calf in archaeology. But anyway, that really pins it down for us. So they picked on something that was existing, and then they attached God's name to it and say this is Yahweh, and they redefined Yahweh. And this became very important because King Jeroboam, king of Israel, the northern kingdom, didn't want people to go down to Jerusalem to worship God in the temple. And so he created 2 golden calves, one in Bethel in the south and one in Dan in the north, so that people can go there and worship Yahweh instead. Okay, so this is a redefining of God. And I think it is important that we do not redefine God. The 4th point is, I should not ask for a God I can bend to my will. Now, how so? Well, you see, Aaron told them to bring earrings, and they did, and then they brought it all there. But they went to Aaron, so they wanted somebody whom they could manipulate. If it had been Moses, they would know that Moses would have said a flat no. But Aaron was a more manageable character, and so that was what they did. They went to Aaron and asked him for an image of some sort to worship. Now, Aaron, interestingly, did this, okay? He fashioned it into a golden calf. And later when Moses came down, Moses asked his brother, what did you do? He said, well, the people wanted a god. I asked for the gold earrings. I took the gold earrings. I threw it into the fire, and out came this golden calf. I mean, kind of a lame excuse. It doesn't just happen like that, but that was what he said. They wanted a high priest. They wanted a high priest who was malleable. But at the same time, some people have asked, what was Aaron's role in this? I mean, why wasn't he reprimanded more severely. He seems to have gotten off quite easy over here. Well, I think some people have suggested this, that perhaps Aaron was stalling for time, waiting for Moses to come down, and so he said, well, do this and do that, and then, but when he couldn't stall for time anymore, he did what the people wanted him to do, and then when he saw that they were worshipping the golden calf, he tried to redirect their attention and say that the golden calf is Yahweh, so that maybe I get 50% right, that kind of an idea there. Okay, now, we can also understand that Aaron was probably fearing for his own safety when he was doing it, or perhaps it's a little bit like a politician, trying to do the doable, Don't strive for too high an ideal because the people would have a problem understanding that. So let's come to some kind of a compromise. Now, and by way of connection, I think it's important for us to ask ourselves, in our spiritual walk, have we ever been confronted with something that we are doing that's not quite right? I was a young man then, a teenager, and we were talking, there was a intern pastor there, and I was rebuked very strongly by this intern pastor. I don't think he was all correct, but I think he had some things correct. He scolded me, and actually I didn't know what he was scolding about. I didn't really quite understand what he was saying, but it hurt anyway, and I mulled over it for a long time. I eventually understood what he was saying, and he was at least 50% right. So, but the mere fact that something happened when I was a teenager, and today I'm quite a few years beyond the teenage years, I can still remember that incident, and it tells you that it was a hard lesson, but it was a lesson anyhow. And I think sometimes we want spiritual leaders to be nice and fuzzy all the time. But if they are nice and fuzzy all the time, sometimes we don't learn things that we need to learn. Now, I'm not suggesting that you should be harsh or should be offensive in any way, but sometimes there are times when we may receive something from a person not with the best intention, not in the best possible way, and yet there are valuable developments for us. And we need to be careful, on the contrary, to be searching for people who are always affirming us, who are always saying nice things to us. Now, if you read Charlie Brown cartoon, Peanuts, you'll notice that once in a while Charlie Brown gets a hug, and then he will say, I needed that. And Americans like to say, I need a hug, can you give me a hug? And they are feeling kind of down or low, and they ask, can you give me a hug? And that's all nice. Now, I'd like to ask some of you who are perhaps not so young, do you recognize this character? Anybody recognizes this character? Frankenstein, yes, Frankenstein. The cartoon character is called Frankie, okay? The cartoon character is called Frankie, short for Frankenstein, and he's the unlikely superhero of a certain cartoon series. Now, the cartoon series is not very popular. It only ran from 1970 to 1971, and it is called the Groovy Ghoulies. Okay, so those of you older guys, you might remember the Groovy Ghoulies, alright? And there is this one thing about this cartoon that I remember. I don't remember anything else about this series except for this one thing, okay? This bungling superhero Frankie will be doing stuff and he's always making mistakes, okay? And then he would get zapped by electricity, okay? Then when he's zapped by electricity, all his internal parts will show. And then after he gets zapped, he says, I needed that, and so that is his pet phrase. So when I was looking up all these things, I entered the Google search, which cartoon character says, I needed that, and it came out, okay? Because that was his signature phrase. Here is this guy who is bungling, and he needs a shot every now and then to get himself back in order again. And sometimes we need that. We need corrections to get us back in order again. And these corrections show us what is working within us. Sometimes things are not right. Sometimes things need to be exposed. And so I thought it was kind of cute that this cartoon character would say, I needed that. Of course, there are other people in the Bible who needed that too. The Apostle Peter, many times he sticks himself forward, and then Jesus would confront him in a certain way, and he needed that. He needed that correction. He needed that rebuke. He needed that change. Of course, we are not saying that we should be offensive. We certainly try not to be offensive. But we can also be taking offense because there is something that's some point of disagreement. And I think we should be sensitive. And we should forgive every offense that is done against us. Sometimes it's unintended. Sometimes it's, even if it's harsh or intended, I think we need to forgive and to move on. Because that is the way of the cross. We need to learn that lesson and to forgive the hurt. Okay, we can remember the hurt, but just to forgive it and to learn that lesson well. It is funny how I seem to know exactly what everybody else needs, but when somebody confronts me with a wrong, I tend to say things like, I know myself best of all. You don't know me. This is a favorite phrase today, right? Somebody is confronted with something and say, you don't know me. But guess what? It may be true. I don't know you. But the other person seems to think he knows you. Okay, so it is this kind of situation where we seem to know where other people have gone wrong. But when other people tell us that, we say, you don't know me. Okay, so I think we really need to ask if we have got that kind of a concept with God. Now, so the first thing is that the people wanted a compliant priesthood. Okay, the second thing is that the people wanted to worship the Lord in their own way. So it is worshiping the Lord, but worshiping Him in their own way. And what did they do? We are told that they sat down to eat and drink and got up to engage in revelry. Now, what does that mean? Well, in the NIV, it says revelry. In the NLT, it says revelry. In the KJV, it says they got up to play. Now, we don't know exactly what they did. Okay, it was a general term. Okay, we don't know exactly what they did. But it was carousing in a way that was not pleasing to God. It was offensive to God. Perhaps it was a little bit like Carnival. In Brazil, they had that once a year. Perhaps it's a little bit like Carnival. Now, it does not necessarily mean a sexual acts, but it would be wrong to exclude sexual acts in this got up to play idea. And how do we know that? Well, what were they worshipping? They were worshipping the golden calf, the bull calf. And that is a symbol of virility, of sexuality. The Egyptians worshipped that in their god Apis, that was an adult bull. And the calf may be, and I don't know, we don't really know a whole lot about why they chose this image, but it is possible that the calf represents the budding nation, a budding god. It's just like Singapore has a crescent moon, right? And the crescent moon signifies a new nation that has come into existence. So the calf might represent something new that was coming onto the scene, and themselves being part of this newness. But whatever it is, it would not exclude sexuality. You see, in our world today, we emphasize productivity. And in the world then, it was the same thing, productivity, except that productivity is more clearly defined as fertility. So today you produce things, and you do not need any sexuality to produce things. But in the past, they produced animals. Okay, the animals have to mate to produce more animals. People have to sleep with one another to produce more children. So productivity and sexuality went hand in glove. And it is not. So the idea here is a very powerful motivation for the people, because when they worship the God of productivity, the God of fertility, and they engage in different acts to represent this fertility, this productivity, well, that was what they were up to at that point in time. Now today, we also continue to struggle with sexuality, but I'd like to focus a little bit more on our struggle with productivity. Now, we always view productivity as a good thing. We want to be more productive. We are trying to be more productive. And indeed, productivity is a good thing. But remember this, what is a false god? A false god is a good thing, something good that becomes the ultimate. A good thing becoming the ultimate thing becomes a god. You know, when the drive is for productivity and nothing else counts, then that becomes a god. It is not productivity at any price, and probably that is the most common idolatry today. You know, we don't have idols of golden calves and apis and all that, but we have the god of productivity to which everybody bows and pay homage. The god of prosperity. That is the twin of productivity. Why do you want to produce? Because you want to prosper. You want to get more wealth. So prosperity is also a good thing. But when prosperity becomes an ultimate thing, then it becomes an idol thing. Now, why do I say this? Well, we are saying this because many times we try to bend God to our will to become the God of prosperity and productivity. And this is really not what God is about. In fact, many times in the Bible, you see, the Bible talks about being effective for God. But effectiveness is different from strict efficiency. You know, we know what was commanded of Israel when they were harvesting the field. They were told to leave the edges unharvested. You know, that was inefficient. I mean, the way to think about business is that you need to harvest up the whole field, right? I mean, why do you leave stuff behind for? But they were told to deliberately leave things behind. You know, when I hear business people talk, they say, why are you leaving money on the table? Have you heard that expression? Why are you leaving money on the table? You know, you need to grab everything that there is to grab. Well, here, the Bible clearly encourages and tells Israel to be inefficient. Okay, so that the poor people can come and gather, you know, and they can work for their own food. They can work for their own sustenance. Now, a highly efficient system would be something like this. A highly efficient system would be that I harvest everything, nothing is left in the fields, and now I've got everything, and now the poor people come to me, and then I do a means testing. Okay, are you poor enough to get this? Okay, if you are, I give it to you. You're not poor enough, sorry, you know, you won't get this. You know, we become very efficient, and that efficiency is not effective because it is in that inefficiency of the harvesting system that you find that helping the poor became more effective work than what people are doing today. So we cannot worship the God of productivity, we cannot worship the God of prosperity, and we cannot make excuses for it because, you know, God allows inefficiency in our lives. And of course, sometimes if you are too harsh about yourself, you think you're not efficient enough, know that God is not judging you by any KPI of any sort, and He's not taking, checks against your life about your efficiency, but rather He wants that relationship with us, and of course He wants us to be effective in what we do. Well, so why is it so dangerous to want such a God? Well, the first reason why we don't want such a God, a God that we can manipulate, that we can redefine, that we can see, that we can manage, is this, that we can incur the wrath of God. God is not happy when you try to do that to Him. Okay, we are told that the Lord struck the people with a plague because of what they did with the calf that Aaron had made. So by doing so, we incur God's wrath. The second reason is this: if we perceive God through our imagination rather than through God's revelation, then we end up worshipping the God of our imagination. And that worship is worthless, and it's a worthless worship to a worthless God. So I think we really need to rethink whether or not we have created a God within our own heads that is not really God, but something else. Now, I think it is, let's see if I've got the right slide. I think it is unhelpful to begin a conversation or to begin your mental processes by saying, I think God is, okay, or what do you imagine God to be? Because invariably self gets in there, okay? I mean, you get what I'm saying? If I ask myself, who do I imagine God to be? Guess what? Some of me is going to get inside the picture of God. Okay, because we are subjective creatures. But I think it's a lot more helpful if we begin the statement or our thought processes with the statement, the Bible tells me God is. Then we lock in our thought processes, we lock in the true idea, the true concept of who God is. Some people have asked me, are we worshipping the same God? If this other religion is monotheistic and your religion is monotheistic, and you worship one God and worship the other God, does it mean we're worshipping the same God? Well, in this particular instance, you find that they were actually worshipping God with the right name even. But when the concept of God is one of their own imagination, it is no longer God that they were worshipping. And therefore, it is important for us to anchor ourselves. You see, J.I. Packer correctly says that what we think of God is vitally important because it affects everything else in our lives. Can you imagine a person who lives on the false promises? Somebody might come up, and it has happened before, one Christian telling another Christian, oh, the Lord shows me and tells me that this or that will not happen. I know of a brother who was going through a divorce, and he was very, very sad that his wife was leaving him. And he says, I was attending this church, and then a person came to me, and the preacher said, I know some of you are going through divorce, but don't worry, God is going to see you through. Just stick by it, and you'll not be divorced. Well, the divorce went through anyway, And he became very, very dejected because of these. We are trying to manage God. We are trying to say, God must answer me in this way. If I pray in this way, God must answer me in this way. If I do this, God must do it in this way. We don't manage God. And it can cause a lot of misery in our lives if we try to manage God. But go back to the God of the Bible and be blessed through the God of the Bible. The Bible tells us this. In the past, God spoke to our ancestors through the prophets at many times and in various ways. But in these last days, He has spoken to us by His Son. Now, what do we mean by this? This is the dilemma of the invisible. You see, the Israelites had a tough time trying to imagine an invisible God. Everybody else's God has an image, and God says, I'm not going to make any image to represent me. They were struggling with that. But it was a necessary struggle because God cannot be represented. And it was a very important step to truth. But the reality remains that we have difficulty comprehending an invisible God and trying to just apprehending the invisible God. And so the Bible tells us that God has given us that final revelation, and that is through Jesus Christ. The text is wrong. It's Hebrews 1:1, not 11:1. And that God has spoken to us through His Son. That means when there are stuff in the Old Testament that we don't understand about God, or there are things that are happening in our lives that we don't understand about God, then what do? Look to Jesus. Because He walked this earth. He interacted with people. He dealt with issues in His life. And so if we are in doubt as to, what is God's take on this? How should I understand God in this situation? Then all we need is to look to Jesus. And this is where we see that the revelation of God is complete in Jesus Christ. We just celebrated Christmas, and that is what it is. God in human flesh. God incarnate. And we praise God because He has made Himself known clearly through Jesus Christ. So let this new year begin with the right relationship with the one and only true God. Let us pray. Oh, gracious God, we want to pray that You help us draw near to You with a humble heart, that we would not be presumptuous, that we would not define You according to our own likes and dislikes, but to come before You in humility, to bow before You, and to acknowledge who You are according to Your word. In Jesus' name, amen.